Welcome everyone. And I'm the Associate Director of Program on Turkey at Stanford. So our program is housed at the Center on Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law. It's a platform for critical analysis and research on politics and society in Turkey. Through research projects and speaker events, the program seeks to provide and facilitate an understanding of the changing internal dynamics and external relations of the country. There are two main focuses of our research and programming. First, as you know, Turkey is in the forefront of several political trends in the world. So we ask ourselves in what ways the development in the country contribute to our understanding of these trends, and also the pathways for a democratic and sustainable future. And second, we see Turkey as an important place that can serve as a mirror for American foreign policy and global power. Please check our webpage for publications coming out of the program and join our listserv to learn about our events. We will just put the link now in the chat box. This year we have done our first event on September 29th on the imprisonment of Osman Kavala. As you know, he has been in jail for 4 years without any conviction. This event was part of the Transatlantic Platform for Democracy in Turkey, and we did it with our partner in Humboldt University, Berlin, Center for Comparative Research on Democracy. And we featured professors Dani Rodrik, Şeyla Ben Habib, and human rights lawyer Ayşe Bingöl Demir. As you know, Kavala's unjust imprisonment caused a major diplomatic crisis between Turkey and the US in the last few days. If you want to have a more in-depth political and legal analysis of his case and the contention around it, you can watch that event video again on our website. We will also be posting that now in the chat box. We have two brilliant scholars who are joining me from Istanbul today, and I thank them very much that they accepted our invitation to speak at this late time in Istanbul. Özlem Altan-Olcay is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations and the associate director of the Graduate School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Koç University. She serves as an editor of Gender, Place, and Culture, as well as citizenship studies journals. She has a PhD degree from New York University, Department of Politics, and her research focuses on citizenship studies, gender and development, and it has been supported by New York University's International Center for Advanced Studies, the UN Population Council, the Middle East Research Competition, the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey, the Turkish Science Academy, among others. She published in Development and Change, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Feminist Economics, Gender, Place and Culture, and very many other journals. Our second speaker is Evren Balta. She's a professor of international relations and the chair of the International Relations Department at Özyeğin University. She holds a PhD in political science from the Graduate Center at CUNY. She published in journals such as Party Politics, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Sociology, Gender, Place and Culture. She's the author of a number of books, Age of Easiness from İletişim Yayın Evi in 2019, Global Security Complex in 2002, again from İletişim in Turkey. Neighbors with Suspicion, Dynamics of Turkish-Russian Relations with her co-authors, Introduction to Global Politics, and finally Military State and Politics in Turkey, some of them with co-authors. So her research has been supported by the American Association for University Women, Mellon Foundation, Bella Zeller Scholarship Trust Fund, among others. In 2018, she received the Distinguished Alumni Award of the Political Science Program at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's a senior scholar at Istanbul Policy Center and a member of Global Relations Forum and co-editor of International Relations Journal. She's also the academic coordinator of the TÜSİAD, Turkish Industry and Business Association's Global Politics Forum in 2021. So they are here today with us to talk about their co-authored book, The American Passport in Turkey, National Citizenship in the Age of Transnationalism, which was published last year by the University of Pennsylvania Press. The American Passport explores the diverse meanings and values that people outside the United States attribute to the US citizenship, specifically those who possess or seek to obtain US citizenship while residing in Turkey. So the book is a fascinating resource which demonstrates that the US global power reveals itself not only in terms of foreign policy, but also in the active desires people have for US citizenship, even they do not live in the United States. So the book has recently won the American Sociological Association Global and from the Global and Transnational Sociology section, Best Book by an International Scholar Award. And today, University of Pennsylvania Press has offered us a 30% discount of the book and free shipping within the US. We will be posting also that discount code for you. Please buy the book. It's a very, very important book, and it does a very wonderful job in really linking micro narratives of people, everyday narratives of people with micro politics in the globe and the American hegemony. So it's a really, really great book to see that those connections and the changes. So our speakers will speak about 25 minutes and we will have plenty of time for questions. Please write your questions in the Q&A box. Yes, Özlem, floor is yours.
And will you share the presentation?
Oh, yes. Evren.
I'll be back, okay. Okay, first of all, I want to thank Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law program on Turkey for facilitating this presentation, but we also want to thank Ayça Alemdaroğlu for actually inviting us here and making us part of this program in this manner. You gave a very kind and very nice introduction to the book. I'm just going to repeat that this is a book about American citizenship, but it's a book about American citizenship from the perspectives of people who attribute values and meanings to it from outside of the United States, from Turkey specifically. And in the book, our goal is multifold. We want to basically rethink the ways in which the scholarship addresses the questions around citizenship. We believe that contemporary political shifts give rise to new questions that we can ask about citizenship, both as an institution and also as lived experience. We also want to, from the vantage point of meanings and values of American citizenship, we want to explore US power, US global power, the concept of the American empire, believing that everyday experiences of people, everyday imaginaries of people from outside of the United States can give us important clues about the workings of the empire. Now I'm going to pass the mic to Evren to give us the central questions and identify the contextualization of the book.
Okay, thanks, Özlem, and thanks, Ayça. It was a great introduction. I'm really embarrassed right now. Okay. Well, thanks, Özlem, for the introduction as well. And let me talk about a little bit about the theoretical background or the conceptual background very briefly though. We do know that there is an ever-expanding literature on how citizenship interacts with macro-level political shifts and context, domestic context. It could be domestic context or global context. You could say context-specific changes. And that literature has shown us that the citizenship regimes do not always evolve to expand rights or even retain existing bundle of rights. In fact, there are many cases where they regress. And we also do know that citizenship regimes are many, diverse, and unequal in terms of rights and opportunities they provide to the people. So therefore, as a starting point, we do argue that, and we are following many before us, an evolutionary or homogenized approach to citizenship cannot account for these regressions or the inequalities between citizenship regimes. So as I said, we started our book with this very basic premise of citizenship studies, but added a transnational aspect to it, which is also, I mean, a lot of people has done before us as well. And we know that today, people's definitions of belonging include the nation state, but there are many, many more identity narratives they draw in. More and more people are nowadays mobile. They aspire, if they're not mobile, they aspire to be transnationally mobile. Or again, they aspire to establish their lives in places other than their home countries. And we also know that there is an inequality aspect in this. It's easier for some people than for others. Your ability to move across borders has a lot to do with where the journey starts, where your own journey starts. So we thought that, not unlike many other scholars studying citizenship, this transnational aspect requires new questions to capture the role of mobility in reconstructing or rethinking of what citizenship means in an increasingly transnational world. So these are our questions that guided us throughout the research. And inspired by these questions, we basically ask more specific questions. So the general questions we have are on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we have more specific questions, the questions that we ask in the book. And the questions we have, I'll just read them. How do we rethink citizenship as a concept? How do we reconceptualize the relationship between the nation state and citizenship, inequality and citizenship, when nation states, when borders are rigid for some and completely flexible for others? Maybe not completely, completely may not be the right word, but more flexible for the others. And in the book, we translate these general questions to our case-specific questions. And these questions are: what are the values and meanings of US citizenship in an increasingly transnational world? What transnational values and meanings can be attached to national citizenship regimes? And what do these meanings and values imply for the way we conceptualize citizenship? So I'll stop here and ask Özlem. Özlem, would you like to talk about the research we did to explore these questions? It's just, floor is yours.
Sure. So to explore these questions, we actually did, over the course of 3 years, 110 plus interviews with 3 groups of people. We began with Turkish families who traveled from Turkey in the later stages of their pregnancy to give birth to their children in the United States, to make use of the birthright citizenship principle and get US citizenship for their children from birth. Then we moved on to 2 other groups: natural-born American citizens who were raised in the United States but moved to Turkey in their adult years and settled in Turkey for a variety of reasons. Finally, we interviewed Turkish American citizens who were naturalized in the United States, but again, in later stages in their lives, decided to come back to Turkey, resettle in their home countries. And we collected an amazing array of stories, and I'm going to talk about the patterns that emerged from these interviews, which make the backbone of the arguments that we're going to later on talk about. But I want to say a couple of things about our own specific positionalities, which actually inspired the book. Our book journey began almost 9 years ago with an offhanded observation that we made. We were hearing more and more stories of people who wanted to go to the United States, or who were planning to go to the United States, or who were going to the United States to give birth to their children there. And we began talking about this phenomenon, and we both realized that we had both been ourselves reprimanded by these groups of people for not having done the same thing for our own children. So this kind of evoked a little bit of a guilt, but also probably this bigger question. Why was it that people were assuming that this was a good idea? Why was it that people were assuming that this was a common expectation? What made this a common topic of conversation? So we could also see that this was not something that was only happening in Turkey. From anecdotal evidence, we could see from US media that the practice was popular among wealthy families from places such as China, Russia, India, South Korea. Then we, out of curiosity, approached the Turkish officials to gather some census data that is not available readily. And we made a back of the envelope calculation. We estimated that around the time that we were doing this calculation, possibly 500, 600 people every year was doing this in Turkey, or doing this, going to the United States. Now, this is a small number compared to the number of births in Turkey, number of births in the United States every year, or migration patterns in general. But from thinking of it from a different perspective, we can say that this is not such an insignificant number because, well, for people to be able to do that, they have to have resources. So that means this is a minority of people in Turkey. At the same time, we're talking about a group who is pregnant at any moment in time. So 600 compared to that is an interesting number. So that was the, so that was the birth of our research. We began with the interviews with the parents, mostly mothers, and we were motivated by the questions of why they made this decision, how they made this decision, and how the journey transpired. As the interviews piled up, we could see that there were certain patterns that repeated themselves. Mothers saw the children's US citizenship as an exit option. In an environment of growing authoritarianism and conservatism and political turmoil. US citizenship, and this is the wording that came up several times, was described as an insurance for the children, which would hopefully for the parents facilitate a seamless exit out of Turkey to an access to the United States, again, for the children, if these political risks became intolerable. Parents also described that when they looked at the US passport for the children, they saw it as a consolidation of the children's membership in a globally privileged network of people who could travel seamlessly across borders and who could settle anywhere else in the world, and could do this much easier compared to the majority of the populations of the world. But it has to be emphasized, these narratives were not only about strategic calculations. When people try to explain their motivations, all sorts of emotions also came up. People talked about their aspirations of freedom, the sense of loss they felt in the political direction that Turkish politics was taking. They talked about their own self-identifications as cosmopolitans, which they could not exercise as easily because they don't have this passport. Their own anxieties of belonging in this new Turkey, which denied these narratives. And these anxieties also translated into the anxieties they felt for the children's futures. And of course, anxieties of motherhood, the idea of having to do the best possible choices for the children. When we finished these interviews, we realized that we were only talking with people who actually did not have the status. Oftentimes, they did not even want it for themselves, but we wanted to also understand how people perceived, experienced US citizenship from outside of the United States. So we expanded our groups and included natural-born US citizens in Turkey and Turkish-American dual citizens also in Turkey. In the group of natural-born US citizens, we were able to see again two distinct patterns that added on. Those who moved outside of the United States for work reasons, first of all, started their narratives with descriptions of shrinking job markets in the United States and the death of the American dream in the United States. And as Americans, they described to us that they realized they could move and find jobs elsewhere in the world much easier than many other nationalities. In this sense, for them, as opposed to this other group who's trying to get their kids to the United States, American citizenship, the American passport, reduced this time economic risk because they could just get out of the United States when need be. In fact, there was a second thing that was happening. We listened to a lot of stories of upward mobility when people moved outside of the United States to the developing world, or in this case, Turkey. Some people talked about increased purchasing power. Other people talked about incredible career opportunities or fast-track careers. And yet others talked about status upward mobility in the sense that they were hanging out with income brackets that were not accessible to them back in the United States. Again, people did not just talk about instrumental advantages. There was a lot of questioning, self-exploration about what it meant to be an American outside of the United States. And in these narratives, we could see two layers of distinction, two narratives of distinction that piled on one top of another. On the one hand, interviewees distanced themselves from regular Americans, they call them, regular Americans who never left the United States and who had absolutely no idea about politics outside of the United States, and also the power, violence, US government was capable of exercising elsewhere. But they also talked about how they were distinct from the majority of Turkish citizens because they had internalized, they said, freedoms and rights that they grew up with. Their upbringing as people with voice, and they in fact said that a lot of the times probably they became desirable employees because of these values that they had internalized as opposed to what they perceived was lacking in the majority of the Turkish society. So in these stories, being an American in Turkey had a value and came with a specific symbolic recognition that it did not have had these people stayed in the United States. And finally, the Turkish Americans. So these stories, their stories uniquely highlighted something else, the value of mobility and circulation the US passport or the dual citizenship status provides. Meaning, at the time of the interviews, Turkey was taking a plunge towards regression, in a political regression. And these interviews had made the decision to come back after having settled in the United States, having built lives there. Now they had come back and were trying to resettle in Turkey. But that meant, the macro-political context meant that they were constantly asking themselves, had they done the right thing? But then during the interviews, once they started this questioning, self-exploration, they kept repeating to themselves and to us, if things became intolerable, unbearable, they could just move back to the United States. It would become difficult with age, but they could do that because they could see that given also the political environment in the United States, this option would increasingly be open only to those with official ties. Well, of course, these stories and narratives were being articulated to us at a particular moment in time over the course of a few years. With its own continuities and shifts in terms of macro-political circumstances. So, Evren, would you like to talk about those macro-political contexts?
This is the macro-political context slide. Thank you, Özlem. And Özlem basically talked about the lived experiences and narratives that we listened to during our research, roughly between 2013 and 2015, right? Or 2012 and 2015. I mean, we stopped talking to people around 2015, I guess. So, as I said, and as Özlem asked, I want to shift focus to the macro-political context a little bit. And this is because individuals almost always strategize at the intersection of institutions that regulate citizenship, political contexts that affect their lives, and individual resources that they have, which are almost always unequal. The first shift that we note for this contemporary period, which marked at least the narratives of the two groups that we talked to, had to do with this globally increased acceptance of dual citizenship. And that's a very, I mean, that change has been going on, but that change really affected their decisions, which is the global, as I said, the globally increased acceptance of dual citizenship was very important in their narratives. So while until 1980s, most states used to prevent multiple citizenship, today we know that more than 100 states accept or tolerate multiple citizenship. In 1981, the Turkish Nationality Act was amended to remove the obstacles to dual citizenship. In the USA, several Supreme Court rulings make loss of US citizenship impossible without the consent of the citizen. And this is actually a world in which individuals in a growing number of countries are legally free to become a citizen of another country without necessarily giving up their birth citizenship. So not everyone we talk to, with whom we have talked to, had dual citizenship, but the ways in which they narrated their experiences revealed how the possibility of dual citizenship is an important component of their everyday strategy is. And I say strategy is, this is an important component or concept of our book, because basically states have historically always been strategic in building, changing, enforcing citizenship regimes. But what is novel today, these individuals that we were talking to act as citizenship strategists. They combined different sovereignty regimes through either the acquisition of multiple passports or by simply through their mobility. So they basically combined, I mean, all this, they played with this citizenship regimes, you could say. This is the first changing macro political context that we need to understand or keep in mind in order to understand how these individuals strategize or negotiate different sorts of citizenship regimes. The other context that we have to keep in mind, which is also a general trend, is the increased transnational connections. Since 1980s, as we all know, the world has experienced an increased transnationalism and a new generation of transnationalist professionals in the global south. These actors are intensely connected with the Western lifestyles and consumption patterns because of their disproportionate economic power, which is also related to the growing economic power of their home countries. As you know, this was a period in which the share of global south in the world economy was increasing significantly. So you have this individuals with growing purchasing power, growing connections, and aspiring to be part of the global world, and institutionally, which now is institutionally possible because of the acceptance of dual citizenship. These actors are also connected with the Western lifestyles, the increased availability of such goods and services, domestic availability of such goods and services. So this was the case in Turkey too. There is also the fact that the newly urbanized middle classes in Turkey have already strong connections with the West, specifically with the US. And the association was the result of intense political economic connections with the United States that spanned the last 2 centuries. This is a history we explore in the book in one chapter, where we delineate the missionary and business networks, American experts who work with the early Republican governments, the large-scale privatization of the education system in the 1990s, increasing number of students pursuing undergraduate and graduate degrees in the United States, increasing number of professionals working in the United States, growing fascination with American culture, real products and practices. So in a way, we basically looked at the social history of American-Turkish bilateral relations in one of the chapters in order to provide the context of this aspiration for American citizenship. And as I said, this availability of dual citizenship for these individuals and this growing connections, not just material, but symbolic connections, it provided the opportunity structure to these individuals to become American citizens or to aspire to become American citizens. But that aspiration is also related to what's going on in the domestic front. In fact, what we have witnessed that the aspiration to institutionally connect, not just culturally anymore, which wasn't enough, as Özlem said. I mean, these individuals or families saw that this cultural connection with the West is not enough anymore. They really needed the institutional connection. And domestically, what is happening at the domestic front, as I said, first of all, it was basically desecularization trend. When we started our research, the majority of the people were talking about Turkey becoming a more religious and more conservative state. So they wanted, especially their daughters, to be out of Turkey, or to give them the opportunity to be out of Turkey. So this is, this is a different type of group. We can talk about that. But later on, some of the people began to talk about, specifically after 2013, 2014, there is a shift in their discourses, and they began to talk about the de-democratization trend in Turkey. So you had two discourses, desecularization and de-democratization, and the experiences of these two groups were slightly different. Their values were different and this and that, but they both shared an intense fear of Turkey's future and a desire to control their future, their family's future, their kids' future, and this and that. Given the fact that the immigration policies as well, including but not limited to the US, has been taking a restrictive turn, and the populist rhetoric is spreading across the world, accompanied by intense policy debates on protecting borders and collective identities and this and that. So this fear of being excluded from the West and from the global connections really heightened. And that is basically heightened not through this domestic context, as I said, and also the global context of populism, nationalism, protecting borders, exclusion, and this and that. So let me stop here and summarize the arguments that we basically had up until now. We make four interrelated arguments in the book based on this empirical discussion and the contextual discussion and the theoretical background. We are arguing that national citizenship citizenships are hierarchically ordered with respect to meanings and strategic values they can generate outside of country borders. Second, we do argue that there are stark inequalities between citizenship regimes, not just with respect to domestic rights and opportunities, but with respect to transnational strategic opportunities. And third, we are arguing that we need to move beyond poorly instrumentalist approaches to citizenship practices, because usually the people who are writing on this type of strategic citizens focus on the instrumentalist part. And finally, we do argue that there's a room for theorizing the contours of American empire by linking these discussions to individual citizenship narratives outside of the United States. Özlem, do you want to start end by discussing this last aspect?
Sure. So we're going to go over these arguments in a little bit more detail, but that will be the final slide. That was the final slide. So the first argument that we make, based on the patterns that we have discussed, is that it is under these individual crisis and collective crisis conditions that American citizenship, or perhaps this is something also we open up in the book, perhaps citizenship in a number of Western countries becomes even more valuable as a risk management tool, as a facilitator of unequal geographical mobility, cross-border mobility specifically, upward class mobility, status mobility in transnational spaces, also as a signifier of claims of cosmopolitanism, modernity, and the West, and as a marker through which to negotiate hegemonic national narratives. So based on these hierarchies of meaning and values associated with national citizenship regimes outside of countries of origin, we argue that there is room to rethink the concept of transnational citizenship. Transnational citizenship often centralizes identity narratives and cultural practices beyond the nation state in connection with intensified cross-border mobilities and exchanges. But we argue that becoming, claiming transnationality is really not disconnected from one's national citizenship status. For instance, the majority of the adult US nationals that we talked with who have had this status from their birth did not really express the need or desire for Turkish citizenship. Yet everyone else we talked to, these two other groups, wanted the status for their children, or the Turkish Americans always talked about how the dual citizenship status made everything very different for them. This is because additional citizenships bring marginal advantages to those who are citizens of the countries of the global north when they move outside of their countries of origin. They can already travel, exit, and retain their status outside of home countries without necessarily having to acquire or strive for citizenship in their countries of residence. So this is a world in which you can no longer claim privileges of cross-border mobility without an institutional bond with a privileged national citizenship. So the argument therefore goes, the second argument, conditions of transnationality are shaped at the intersection of inequalities between and within citizenship regimes. Inequalities between citizenship regimes shape individual desires for and strategies to access and also exit to and from certain national contexts. But again, this is not just about inequalities between citizenship regimes. Global sorting of citizenship rights also interacts with and shapes local hierarchies, local inequalities. For instance, because your access to the US citizenship, if you're not born or if you're not living there, depends on your resources ultimately. Or because the opportunity for transnational mobility, once you acquire such a privileged citizenship, is now a marker of class distinctions, a marker of one's status wherever you live. But I feel like I have sounded too much like an instrumentalist, which is exactly the opposite of the argument we make in the book. So Evren, do you want to correct me?
Well, maybe very briefly. I mean, we basically argue that, as I said in my previous presentation, it's not just the strategies or instrumental thinking that guides these individuals. There is always more in individual practices than pure opportunism. And US citizenship in these narratives is often a strong signifier of particular cultural practices and values. And people often compare what they saw as different values and cultural practices in two societies and negotiated their belonging to each through various languages of citizenship. So we do basically argue that we cannot capture what's going on if we approach citizenship practices of these people as purely strategic and instrumental. This is what mainly majority of the citizenship studies do, looking at these individuals as just strategists. But I'll ask you a last question, maybe, if I may, Özlem. You can comment on that. This citizenship narratives also signify something about how US is perceived in the rest of the world. Do you remember, Özlem, that we, during our research, we were contacted by a staff member at the US consulate in Ankara, and he wanted to know if he had any insights about a specific question code, and something like this. How was it that anti-Americanism in Turkey was extremely high, even though everyone he came into contact with seemed to want to live in the United States? So perhaps that is my question. Perhaps you could end this presentation with how we spin this question into a broader argument of US hegemony and US global power.
Right. When this person contacted us, I don't think we gave him a sufficiently sophisticated answer. We were in the thick of the research. We were still collecting the data. He never contacted us again. I don't think he liked our answer. But over time, I think we were able to rethink this question. There is indeed a tension here. Anti-Americanism is on the rise globally, especially in Turkey. But there's also this increasing allure of being an American citizen. And I think this tension itself is productive of new questions. We think that this tension itself is productive of new questions we should be asking to understand both global power relations and the place of America in the world. So a lot of the times, geopolitical power of the United States is often traced to material inequalities between states, the dynamicism of those inequalities over time. But we also suggest that perhaps we can explore its links with transnational imaginaries of and experiences with America and American citizenship. So ours is an exploration of the American empire's complex workings at the intersection of the history of US foreign policy, US geopolitical power, US-Turkey relations and the privileges people associate with as a result of this historical experience with US citizenship outside of the United States in Turkey. We suggest that these American citizens around the world are the markers of a new kind of empire. This empire transcends both macro-political relations and individual actions. When US citizenship is valued and found meaningful for a variety of reasons outside the United States for diverse groups of people. Now, the American dream, as I said, the second group had told us it's dead in the United States, but now it is the American dream, defunct in the United States probably, that survives now outside of the United States. This is a different kind of border formation. Physical passports expand the US borders to include distant locations, to individual imaginaries and experiences of mobility and privilege, and identity narratives that juggle multiple national memberships. That's all we have to say. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Özlem. Thank you, Evren. We have a bunch of questions. I will convey them to you. First, from Duygu Altan, she says, fantastic work, thank you. She says, the term political risk comes up frequently in your discussion of mothers who gave birth in the US. How did your respondents conceptualize political risk? Other than de-democratization and de-secularization, what were some concrete specific examples that they mentioned when describing their fear of increasing authoritarianism?
Mm-hmm.
Evren, do you want to start? I will continue. However, do you want to go?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So, I mean, that was exactly the scenario. So political risk was described in terms of, first of all, de-secularization. A trend that had started already in 2012, 2013, that when we were making these interviews, Gezi movement had not happened yet. It happened afterwards, so people did not really connect it with that. They talked about instability a lot, instability in the sense that they did not know how things would be the next day. So there was this one phrase that came up in both of the interviews that we did separately from one another. This is not Switzerland. People were saying that this is not Switzerland, but they were striving for American citizenship. The idea was they could not see predictability in terms of the wars that Turkey could get engulfed in. They could not see predictability in terms of micro things such as education, the possibilities for education, the systemic changes in the education, which made these people worry about, again, their children's future. Economic circumstances was yet another possibility, with some people imagining that even as a barista in Starbucks, their children might have better lives. There was a lot of discussion of daughters. People told us that, you know, if you are going to have a daughter, you should definitely go and have your child over there. Anything else, Evren, do you remember?
Military service, basically.
Yes, military service, you're right.
It came out a lot if the person that we are talking to has a boy, and immediately they found out that that they were going to have a boy. The military service came to their mind, and they decided to give birth in the United States. And out of that, actually, out of the military service question, which we then began to discuss, or add taxation problem to this as well, we basically discussed how these, you know, like rights and obligations of citizenship for these people become sort of an a la carte menu. I mean, they didn't want the obligations of citizenship, especially when they think these obligations are not just and too heavy, right? Like the military service. And they don't want their children to be doing that, but they wanted citizenship to be composed of all, am I right if I say that, Özlem? I mean, lots of rights, not many obligations, basically. So when I was saying that they were really playing with this different citizenship regimes, and I mean, when I used the word play, I was suggesting that implicitly, that they are basically seeing citizenship, their citizenship, as something that involves rights, basically, right? Maximizing rights and also minimizing obligations. Maybe.
Özlem, do you want to add something, or shall I just pass you?
Yeah, I think this is.
All right, so this is a comment and a question from Nora Fisher-Onar. She says, congratulations on a wonderful, innovative project. So her question is about if any intersectional patterns you may have observed regarding gender, ethnicity, or sectarian affiliation, which you perhaps gestured to with the reference to the desecularization. Was the decision to give birth abroad impacted, for example, by knowledge of the prospective child's sex, by Turkish or Kurdish identity, by Sunni or Alawi orientations, and methodologically, how were you able to parse such intersections, if at all? So I guess you referred to child sex, but maybe you can take up on the other ethnic and sectarian.
I don't think ethnicity came up. It didn't much. What came up was a great deal of emphasis on the loss of sense of diversity in Turkey. But I'm not sure people necessarily meant ethnic diversity. So they were talking about diverse lifestyles. Gender came up a lot. I'm not sure if they made the decision to go because it was a daughter. But I think in hindsight, it became a prism through which to explain the decision. So it became even more important because they did it for their daughter's future. For religion, again, so this is the thing that happens when we give this book talk. Everybody is very much interested in the mothers giving birth in the United States. And I'm very protective of these two other groups of interviews that we did. These intersectional issues actually came up little in the parents' groups, but in the other groups, they came up. For instance, the US citizens, natural-born US citizens, class inequalities came up a lot. They were very much aware of class status. There was a diversity of class status. There was racial diversity, again, in that group. And their experiences in Turkey and the way in which they narrated these experiences, I think, overlapped with those. For instance, those who were not white Americans, who told us stories of, for instance, how they were misrecognized in Turkey, with people asking them questions, where are you really from? Insisting questions. And these questions, interestingly, became part of their identity narratives about this America that they were critical of a few minutes ago, saying that in America, nobody asked these sorts of questions, which of course is untrue because the Turkish Americans told us stories of how they were asked this question in the United States. So the intersectionality component became a way in which these people not only negotiated their own identity narratives, but their relations with their two countries or with the countries where they resided and where which the countries that they have left. Do you want to add something about religion? Because that came up in your research, Evren, in the Turkish Americans.
Well, this is a question that we're frequently asked as well, whether the conservative Turks, it's okay, it may seem natural for the secular, more liberal, Western-oriented Turks to aspire to become a Western citizen or American citizen more specifically. But whenever we are presenting this research, we are frequently being asked whether conservative Turks or Kurds or AKP supporters, let me be specific, wanted to be American citizens, right? And we have came across in our research that, some of our interviewees were basically conservatives, AKP supporters, and they also shared the same desires and similar fears. Right. So that was very interesting for us. They were complaining about how unstable Turkey is, how they wanted to live somewhere else, how they want their children to live outside of Turkey and all those things. It seems that this macro political context of Turkey and the way that they experience it sometimes very different than how their individual imaginaries or how they pursue the Western power. So, I mean, this is what I can add. Are you referring to the this religious guys who were praying?
Yeah.
But I think that's a long story.
Yeah.
Let's skip that.
All right. For our audience, could you please write the questions in the Q&A menu down there? It's easier for us to see them. Sometimes they get lost in the chat, but now I'm seeing one from the chat menu. This is a question from Aslı Gür. She thanks for your research. Her question is, I'm wondering if you came across any critical voices from individuals holding two citizenships who use this transnational position to compare, question, and grow awareness of the citizenship inequalities, any turning their transcultural positions into social activism to further rights for both sides.
Let me give up a little bit of a contextualization. Now, for the parents group, we conducted the interviews in 2012 and partially in 2013. This was before Gezi mobilization, but when we were conducting the interviews with the other two groups, Gezi had already happened. So a lot of the people, both the natural born Americans and the Turkish Americans, had actually participated in that movement. They were there, or the people who were afraid to go to the Meydans were supportive. Their engagements with the mobilizations that were happening were supportive. And it was through the vantage point of this very recent experience that they constantly criticized what was missing in Turkey. Now, some of these people also kept saying that I'm not wax poetic about what is missing in the United States either. So they talked about, for instance, the right to arms and how bizarre it sounded anywhere else outside of the United States, given the countries that they have lived. They talked about horrible education systems also in the United States, etc. But at the same time, I'm not sure, beyond their participation in that more general mobilization, I don't think, at least in the interviews that I've conducted, anyone who came as, actively engaging with this inequality. They were engaging with this inequality, saying that, thank God I have it. But they were critical of the inequality, but they acknowledged that they were on the lucky side. They were critically aware of their privilege, but I don't think they were doing anything on the basis of citizenship rights beyond the mobilization that was happening in Turkey.
Yeah, same here. I'm also seeing a question here in the chat box. And which is very connected what you're saying, Özlem. Albert Hirschman's book titled Exit, Voice and Loyalty, which we cite multiple times in the book and also in the articles that came out before the book on Strategic Citizens of America. One of them is titled. The conceptual background is basically, an important part of the conceptual background in these articles and in the introductory chapter of the book is Exit, Voice and Loyalty. We are basically using this argument of Hirschman saying that here is the Turkish context and the global context rapidly deteriorating, right? And the Turkish context even more rapidly deteriorating in terms of the education opportunities, in terms of secularism, in terms of democracy, rule of law, and this and that. So you have that fact, right? And these people whom we talk to, most of them are very critical. And as Özlem said, some of them participated to the Gezi movement, and they are active citizens, they are privileged citizens, but they are very active, socially active citizens as well. So they tried voice option as well. But here's the thing, this anxiety they had and they had a high levels of anxiety. I mean, even Özlem and I began to have anxiety. These people had the anxiety. Had their anxiety levels very high, beginning of 2000s, maybe, right? What I'm trying to say is that the exit option both is an opportunity and a possibility. So they were like, why should I not use it, right? At least for my children, I have to have that option. And also they were very, this anxiety of Turkey leaving the West, right? So they keep voicing their criticism of Turkey not leaving the West. But at the end, they decided that it's an individual thing. If Turkey leaves the West, I'm not going to leave the West, right? And making this happen only be possible through that institutional link. And as the anxiety increased that Turkey is leaving the West, so that exit option or keeping that exit option in their pocket or possible, the importance of that increased. I think, this is a problem that's happening in many other places as well. But as we have been, talking since the beginning of this presentation, it's basically the domestic deterioration of Turkey really pushed many of these people to the exit option, either for themselves or for their kids.
So I have a question there. So you said you have done the research in 2012 and 2015, but we know that a lot has changed since then, also in the US, right? With the Trump presidency, we've seen, riots in the Capitol Hill. So how elastic are these desires, you think, like aspirations, you think? Do they observe events, do they adjust to what's happening also in the US? Because the place to exit hasn't been a very happy place either. So in that sense, what can you say? I know that this is after your research, but you probably think about it.
Actually, we have been thinking about it. So we finished the research and things started changing even more dramatically as we were writing. And I think we wrote the conclusion a few different times, trying to adjust to the new realities that we were facing. We did not keep in touch with everyone. There were some people that we kept in touch. And what we saw was actually something different. Okay, so there was Trump in the United States. But the perception was whatever Trump was able to do, or as it tries to do, there are still, the belief was then, there are still institutions in the United States which are not as strong in the Turkish case. So it was a comparative paradigm that was driving it then. So, and under Trump's presidency, given that immigration, the expectation was that the immigration is going to be even more restricted, that official bond becomes even more important for these people. What we saw was, for instance, natural-born Americans, some of the people that we kept in touch with, they went back. When Turkey became worse, they went back to the United States or other countries. We also saw, for instance, a few Turkish Americans who had come back in the very late stage, in their 40s, who actually then went back to the United States as well. Now, in terms of the children, a lot of the people that we talked with, everyone was under the age of 16. So at the time, but I know at least some who became incapable of sending their children to the United States for economic reasons, because there's also the economic depression that has been unfolding in Turkey. What I'm trying to say is that these desires and values and meanings attributed to US citizenship from the outside are not that elastic. They won't change within the space of a few years in terms of what happens in the United States. They won't change because there's also the strategic option that, this is the one citizenship that is going to be, that people are going to be able to get with ease. when we're talking about mothers. Or, when we talk about the experiences of Turkish Americans, they still said that they made their lives there, despite all sorts of racisms, despite all sorts of discriminations that they might have experienced, they still made a life there. Yeah, that's, I guess, what I can say. But I think, Evren, you can talk more about this. Yeah.
Maybe I can add something to what you said, Özlem, about the COVID situation, how it changed the perception of the United States. Because in the early days of COVID, people around the world in the global South saw the collapse of the U.S. health system, and I mean, obviously, we haven't had the opportunity to go back to all these people that we talked to and ask them what would be your strategy. But some of the people I talked to who have double citizenship kept underlining the fact that, okay, this dual citizenship really works. See, I mean, it's not the fact that the U.S. or the U.S. health system collapsing in the face of pandemic, or the Turkish system collapsing, or becoming more authoritarian and this and that. It's this ability to be mobile, right? So you have this pandemic, and the US health system is not working well, but the Turkish health system is working well. So move there, live there for a year through the pandemic. And then if something comes up in the US, then move there. So this easiness of mobility through dual citizenship is really what mattered. And something that we kept underlining as well is the fact that it's the US citizenship, not the Turkish citizenship, that gave these people the mobility to move across the borders. That's where the value of the US citizenship comes from. I mean, there is hierarchy between national citizenship regimes. So this is one of the important arguments in the book that we keep going back and back. This hierarchy between different citizenship regimes. You could say that it could be the European citizenship as well, but the European citizenship is more rigid, more difficult to get, and that compared to, like, I mean, let me stop here. Okay.
Right, we have a few more questions. There's a question about the tax burden that was put on the children who were born there. Did you see any cases where people talk about this as a potential problem, like the military service? And have you also, I mean, related to that, are there narratives that, thinking about the future and thinking about maybe giving up one of the citizenship as a, potential way of avoiding some of the obligations? What can you say about that?
Yes, absolutely. That's all over the chapter, especially with the parents. The idea there always was, okay, this is an opportunity. This is a choice that we are giving to these children. There was one case where I remember, for instance, the parents had actually lived in the United States for a long time, but they returned before they were able to get the green card. And one of the reasons why they said, well, they returned before doing that because the tax obligations would be too heavy. And then I asked this person, this mother, why then, did you get it for your child? And she said that, well, this child has the option to get out of US citizenship if she wants to when she is 18. But until then, she doesn't have any obligation anyway. I'm basically foreseeing a future where she can get out of any citizenship that she wants to. The same thing was true for military service. So people imagine that their sons, for instance, might give up their Turkish citizenship past the age of military service, and then possibly, if they wanted, reclaim it. So Evren was talking about this juggling, rights and obligations. None of these were practiced, I have to say. These were all imaginaries. These were imaginaries for a future that people could not pin down what's going to happen in. So they imagine that if, tax becomes a problem, they will give it up. If military service becomes a problem, maybe they will give that up. So that calculation was part of the imaginary around the two citizenships.
For the Turkish Americans, who resettled Turkey, taxation was a problem. But some of them said that we're not that rich to be concerned about taxation. So it was like, being very concerned about taxation. You need to earn a lot of money so that you will be, the tax burden will be high. So some of them were saying that it's the burden, the tax burden, if you're not earning that much money, is not that high. But for the very rich that we also talked to, they were thinking of giving up American citizenship because the tax burden was very high. But then they had already have the opportunities to get different citizenships, like the sort of, like Cyprus citizenship, Malta citizenship, I don't know, right? So Özlem and I, this is not in the book, but Özlem and I also looked at, citizenship market, or citizenship as a property, this market of citizenships that you can choose and pick, and for the very rich, that option is already there. So American citizenship is not really a must. If the tax burden is so high, then they were thinking that we would just give this up. And this idea that, as Özlem was saying, this juggling between rights and obligations, always constantly there.
It's the same thing with the, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
No, it's the same thing with the natural born American citizens as well. A lot of them said that I'm not rich enough to worry about, being taxed here and being taxed there. It's not like there's much to tax on anyway. So yeah, that was the general thing. I had there were a few cases of American citizens who had European citizenships as well. And we asked them whether push came to shove, they had to choose one of the citizenships. Interestingly enough, they said still American citizenship. And the same thing was repeated, I think, with the Turkish Americans too. Had they had to choose a citizenship, they would choose American citizenship. And for the Turkish Americans, the reason was primarily, well, it's more privileged. For the Americans, the natural born American citizens, there was the fear of not ever being able to go back to the United States, and always thinking that still American citizenship is valued more.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about this idea of exit from Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Actually, he says, this is not just getting away from obligations, but these obligations may be perceived as illegitimate. Therefore, that they fall short of legitimacy, and this is related to the issues that you already mentioned, like de-democratization and desecularization. What would you say about that? Did you encounter such sort of narratives of claiming illegitimacy of some of these obligations?
Absolutely.
Already mentioned that, this specifically with regard to the military service, it was seen as unjust, too long, a very heavy burden, not being practiced in other countries, in many of the European countries. So why should I send my child? It's an illegitimate practice. Why should I send my child for 2 years to do military service? So the illegitimacy of those things all constantly there. Of course.
That's why we want to constantly emphasize that these narratives were not just strategic narratives. When people were describing stories of escaping obligation, they were not necessarily saying escaping obligation. They were saying these obligations should not be there for anyone. These problems, these instabilities should not be there for anyone. And they were having anxieties around them. And it was through these, again, citizenship languages that they were narrating these anxieties. So possibly what we should say is, yes, definitely, I agree with this observation. It's the way in which they were both strategizing, but also voicing dissent against these sets of obligations.
I have a question. In this kind of research, like you reach a point where things start to just hear same, like a saturation point. I'm wondering when that came to you in this research, and I'm also interested in what are some of the like striking narratives that you were like, we weren't really expecting that kind of narratives. Can you talk about that? And actually, that I may connect this to a question that was asked earlier about the process of research. Özlem referred to you doing some of the research, some of the interviews, and her doing the other part. Maybe you can also talk about both the striking narratives as well as the process of research itself.
You want to start, Evren, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it's almost 11 o'clock here, but past our bedtime. We are losing our communication. We usually vibe better. So it's getting late, so I'm going to just give a couple of examples from the narratives that we always laughed about, and we always thought they were really interesting. There was this one person who, a natural-born American citizen in his 30s, who had come to the United States because he couldn't find a job anywhere else. He had traveled a great deal in Southeast Asia and decided to settle in Turkey because, well, this is closer to Europe. He can travel here easily. And he started out as a private tutor. Then he became a teacher. And then he started playing in a Turkish band. And then he started being offered jobs in Turkish commercials as the American. And at the time that we were talking with him, he was the in-house editor of a big company. And I thought that this was, I think that we thought this was a very interesting narrative. He said that he saw his life as this video game called Grand Theft Auto, his life in Istanbul as Grand Theft Auto. And we didn't know what it was, so we asked him, so how did this work out? He says that, so at the beginning of the video, apparently you start in a horrible house, horrible job, everything is bad, you don't know anyone, etc. But over time, you strategize, you work hard, and you can make anything happen in Istanbul, not in the United States. So we thought that was very interesting. So that was where the first time we started thinking about this notion of American dream not being possible anymore in the United States, but in Turkey. Another one, this was also a story that we talked a great deal, again, natural born. I guess this was the group that we weren't expecting much. So there were certain things that we weren't expecting in this group. So there was one person who had an American friend. So we didn't talk to this friend, but she talked about this friend who was hired by a Turkish businessman for attending meetings and basically as a pseudo advisor to this Turkish businessman. She didn't know anything about the business that was being handled. Her entire job was sitting in meetings and saying things like, yep, that's how we do things in New York. And she was being paid for this. So this idea of being recognized as an American had a cachet in Turkey that, this person would never be able to do that in the United States. So that was another interesting narrative. There was this one narrative that I remember from Turkish Americans. This one guy who got sworn in as an American citizen, who was very inspired by the ceremony that he attended, the diversity and everything, but he also felt guilty. He came back to Turkey and went to Anıtkabir, which is the mausoleum for Atatürk, to reignite his roots with Turkey. So all these identity narratives that were being given to us was very interesting. You also, so Ayça, you asked a number of questions, but now I'm blanking out.
Striking narratives as well as the process of research, if you could
what do you mean by process of research?
There was a question about if you could elaborate on how you did your research, because it stretched through time. Yes. Contains different groups that you talk to, and two researchers working on it at the same time. So how did you get all together?
So with the first group, so you go ahead, Evren, sen yaptın da.
So for the first group, we had a different research project. So the book didn't start up until we finished with the first group. The idea of the book came after that we did the research on mothers, parents, not just mothers, but mostly mothers. So we were basically interviewing, decided to interview with parents, but they turned out to be mostly mothers. We did the interviews together, half and half, all of them half and half of the interviews done by Özlem, half of them by me. So we finished the first part of the interviews. Then we decided, as Özlem said in the beginning of the presentation, we were getting interested about what it means to be an American outside of America. Because that was basically related to the fact that these people are not Americans themselves, but they wanted an American citizenship for their kids. So we wanted to know and see and sort of, hear the experiences of people who basically experience being an American. So that was the idea, and we had almost 40 or 35 sort of interviews, 35 I guess, 35 interviews with nature-born Americans who live in Turkey. Those interviews mostly done by Özlem, and also I did the Turkish American interviews, so that's how we split the research. So the mothers and parents together, but for those two groups, we have our own group, our own snowballing sample with multiple entries. I don't remember exactly how many interviews we did, but between 35 and 40 for each.
Totally, I think it was 70 something, but I don't remember the division now. 70 something. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to let you go because I know it's very late, but there are questions coming. So I think, use our
go ahead.
time to for those questions. There's one interesting question about the, why do people in Turkey who have this anxiety and wanting to exit and create these opportunities for their kids, like choose America and instead of like British or Canadian citizenships, which may be, less burdensome for the children.
Sorry.
Yeah.
For a very simple reason, because America is one of the only remaining countries that grants birthright citizenship. Right? They cannot get UK citizenship to their kids if they give birth in London. But if they give birth anywhere in the US, then they will get citizenship for their kids. So it's basically for that simple strategic reason. It's easier and possible.
Okay, thank you. Another person asks about if you had a chance to look at other dual citizenship regimes, like dual citizenship situation, like with Bulgaria, for instance, how does that sort of play out, and basically a comparison.
Okay, so we don't really, we haven't looked at these different citizenship regimes, but something that we wrote towards the end of the book in the conclusion. These parents were getting citizenship for the children, but they actually, almost all of them told us that they were not interested in getting US citizenship for themselves. They saw their lives evolving in Turkey. But then since 2015, we began to see other trends emerging, but we haven't systematically analyzed them. So for the very wealthy, and this is not something that is specific to Turkey, there are these investment citizenship packages, which allow people to go to Malta, to Cyprus, to a variety of locations around the world to get citizenship. This is very costly, but wealthy segments of the population, and there's also anecdotal, again, newspaper articles about these sorts of things. Some people invest in real estate in places like Spain and Portugal, again, in return for residence, which gives them access to the Eurozone. There's also, this is an anecdotal evidence, I know that there's also a group of people who are claiming through ancestral links citizenships of a variety of European countries. Some people have gone to Israel, for instance. I know some people have gone to Spain. And actually, for instance, for the case of Bulgaria, Turkey has experienced massive migration from Bulgaria in 2 or 3 different waves throughout the course of Republican history. And now the kids of these immigrants are seeking to find ways of getting the Bulgarian citizenship so as to, again, access the Eurozone. And Bulgarian citizenship requires a number of documents that are only available in a specific archive in Ankara. So the documents are basically the papers that these immigrants had to give up, Bulgarian passports or ID cards that they had to give up to get the Turkish citizenship. And apparently, at one point in time, I think this was a few years ago, that the archive is almost going berserk with the amount of demands coming to get these documents, that it was a complete stalemate situation. So people are, the growth in the problems and the growth in the anxieties mean that people are finding different ways to strategize given different bundles of resources that they have. So yeah, that's what I can say.
Okay, thank you. Okay, last 2 questions. Our colleague Burcu Karhan congratulates you and asks a question about the political anxieties that you talk about. And she asked whether these dual citizens that you talk to are predominantly in Istanbul, or did you talk to other people around Turkey, and how this anxiety plays out in different parts of the country?
Not just in Istanbul, predominantly in Istanbul, but we talked to people from Izmir, Ankara, and a couple of other places too, but mostly people from Istanbul. Well, I mean, in terms of the place of residence, or in terms of the cities that these people were located in, there wasn't much difference. The anxieties that they were basically conveying to us were pretty much similar. And but thinking about, like what we have heard from them is there were basically 2 lines of anxiety, right? I mean, this complete deterioration of the Turkish political system was common, but some of them mostly emphasize, as I said, desecularization, right? Turkey becoming more conservative, more religious, and they were citing the fact that their daughters, could be compulsory veiling and all those things, right? And education becoming more religious, less secular, and all those things. I mean, mostly about the secular aspect of Turkey's political system that they were anxious about. They didn't really much use the concept of, at least then, probably now they would be, using that concept, but then they were basically using the concept of, secularism, or the language of, they were referring to the language of secularism a lot. But there were another group of people who were already complaining about the authoritarian tendency in Turkey, and focusing more on the rule of law and the institutional decay, right? But for both of them, institutional decay, specifically in terms of education or this unpredictability of the system, and this was 2014. So the situation got really, really worse in the last 6-7 years, as we all know. But I mean, that's what they shared, basically, institutional decay, I would say. Both the people who focus more on authoritarianism and people, or the group who focus more on the secular or desecularization, I would say. Mm-hmm. Right?
All right. One last question. Do you have any other project after this? Are you going to sort of follow up on some of the questions that was that rose in this work, or are you, so what are your plans? Is there any other common project that's coming up, or yeah?
We just finished the piece. Maybe Özlem want to talk about that.
We don't have yet a next big thing, but hopefully something will come up. We have been thinking about these skilled migration schemes and the ways in which they redefine meanings of desirable citizen and continue certain hierarchies within citizenship regimes. So we have almost completed an article on that. There's another piece that we're thinking of writing on mobility, the pandemic, and citizenship, but we don't have the next big thing yet.
We're both very interested, I guess, in the commodification of citizenship. So these aspects of, like either the American citizenship, strategic Americans, this high-skilled migration schemes, investment citizenship. We also wrote on investment citizenship together in Turkish though. All these are different aspects. So we used in this last article Polanyi a lot, and how commodification of citizenship is a thing, and it's a process. I mean, you wouldn't say it is as, like citizenship as a commodity or not non-commodity, but it's a gradual process of commodification. So how do we understand that gradual process of commodification of citizenship? So these are all different aspects of that commodification. And I mean, what we keep talking about, for example, and this I always find very amusing. I was presenting our paper years ago in a conference in New York, Association for Nationalities conference, and they were talking, and people talking about investment citizenship, and someone said that, oh, Turkey, creepy citizenship, who would want to buy that? Something like that, right? And then Turkey came up with an investment citizenship scheme, and people are getting it. So there is a market for every type of citizenship, and it's basically shaped by all these, like domestic contexts, regional contexts, macro political opportunities. So and Turkey now has a turquoise card, which is basically a high-skilled migration scheme, which opens a way for many people who wants to become Turkish citizens. But all those things, this inequality and this market of citizenship really fascinates us, and it's a mutual fascination, I guess. So since it's a mutual fascination, I think we'll keep working together, right, Özlem?
That's really wonderful. So I just posted the discount code again in the chat box. It's really hard to write a book. It's really, really hard to write a great book like Özlem and Evren's. Please purchase it and read it. And give them feedback. We're very happy that we were able to host you today. Thanks for joining us. It's late in Istanbul, I know. Good night to you, and I thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayça. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for listening. Bye.